Okay, so I guess we will get started then. My name is Garima, and I'm going to be kind of like the introducer and a bit of a host and assistant to you, Dr. Quentin, during your presentation and during the Q&A after. And I'll start by introducing our guest today, and then I will hand it over to them to give their presentation. So we are very, very fortunate to have Dr. Clair Quentin here with us today. Dr. Quentin used to be a practicing tax lawyer, first at Allen & Overy, and then at a firm specializing in high net worth individuals, and then later at a firm specializing in the not-for-profit sector. They became increasingly involved in tax justice activism, and then became a senior advisor to the Tax Justice Network, which Professor Christians was just speaking about. In 2016, they left practice to pursue a PhD on the political economy of international corporate tax reform, which they finished last year. Dr. Quentin is now working on publishing their PhD and doing a part-time postdoc developing tax policy proposals for an all-party group of UK backbench legislators. Dr. Quentin's presentation today is entitled Intangible Assets and the Thunder of History, and we are very lucky to be hearing from them. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Quentin.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Alison was saying before that I'm a good speaker, and that might be true normally, but it won't be true on this occasion because I'm actually going to read from a script today because what we're going to go into is so complicated that if I just start wittering about it, I'll just end up going off on a tangent and you'll never know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to read. So it's going to be very boring, and I'm going to read from a script, but I do have some pretty pictures on the slides to make up for it. Right, here goes. So I just finished doing a PhD on international corporate tax reform, but I started it without having studied any of the relevant disciplines academically. My knowledge of tax law and tax justice came entirely from practice. And while I was pretty clear on the research questions I wanted to address, I was totally stumped by the bit where you have to kind of situate your work in the relevant literature and set out a methodology and that kind of thing. So I emailed my friend Martin Hearson, who, like me, had gone into a PhD on an international tax topic from a tax justice background. And I asked him what the hell discipline it was I was doing. And he said to me, I should look into a thing called fiscal sociology. Now, what fiscal sociology sounds like to me is people using the methods of sociology, i.e. qualitative and quantitative social sciences research, to answer research questions about the social relations that coalesce around or are articulated through the specificities of tax systems. And sure enough, that's pretty much what fiscal sociology is today. But that isn't how it started. And it turns out that how it started was a lot closer to the kind of thing I wanted to do than what fiscal sociology looks like today. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the origins of fiscal sociology and what I've extracted from those origins for my purposes. And in fact, while this presentation ends with a discussion of some tax policy, the real substance of it is to do with the kinds of thinking that might underpin discussions of tax policy. The analytical conclusions I come to are not innovative. It's the route I take to get there that might be of interest. Okay, so what's fiscal sociology? Fiscal sociology was invented in Austria at the end of the First World War. Austria was a defeated nation and its finances were in a state of crisis. And two contrasting views on that fiscal crisis were elaborated by two Austrian economists, Rudolf Goldscheid and Joseph Schumpeter. And I'm now going to go to my first slide. Brilliant. Okay, great. So thank you. So there in the background is an advertisement for some war bonds. And there in the foreground, Goldscheid's 1917 book and Schumpeter's 1918 essay written in response. And broadly, Goldscheid's argument went like this. Before the modern era, sovereigns used to sit in positions of primacy over systems of land ownership, and so themselves possessed the means to generate revenue. In the modern era, however, the means of production is owned by capitalists. And while sovereign power has been handed to widening demographics through the mechanisms of democracy, what the people have acquired is an institution holding no assets, saddled with debt, and whose fiscal power to issue currency and levy tax on revenues only ends up channeling money back into the hands of capitalists. What's needed, says Goldscheid, is a capital levy bringing the means of production into, oh, hang on, I need to get my next slide, bringing the means of production into public hands. So that's Goldscheid's position. Schumpeter's answer to this was essentially to argue for the freeing of capitalist enterprise from the shackles of state intervention. There we go. And he claimed that doing so will yield such plenty for all, that there'd be no need for either the tax state or eventually for capitalism itself. And here's a pic of old Joe Schumpeter under a heap of plenteous capitalist output, so that you don't forget about this prediction of his, because we're going to come back to it. Okay, so Schumpeter says, free capitalism from the shackles of state intervention, and we'll all be showered with plenty. Okay, so that was Schumpeter's response to Goldscheid's argument that the state should own the means of production. So I get a number of things from this, from this debate between these two. First, when we do fiscal sociology, we're not talking about the state and its power to tax ahistorically. We're talking about the state and its power to tax under the specific historical conditions where the capitalist mode of production prevails. So that's the first thing I get from this. And this is to be contrasted with what you might call an economist's view of tax, i.e. a kind of black hole of inefficiency introduced by horrible, useless bureaucrats into the crystalline Platonic perfection of markets. That crystalline perfection is not an article of the fiscal sociologist's faith. We are rather living in and trying to understand a period of history that possesses specific forms of antagonism, contradiction, and conflict. And the antagonism between capital and the state over revenues is one such antagonism. Now, that may seem like a fairly uncontentious standpoint, but if there are any veterans of the Cold War watching this, they will already have started to fear for what I'm about to do to your young minds, and they're right to do so. Secondly, and relatedly, what I'm getting from this is that we identify capital as an actor in that antagonism on an analytical rather than merely narrative level. So Goldscheid and Schumpeter were talking about literal physical means of producing commodities as privately owned in accordance with the capitalist mode of production. Now, as we're going to see, things are different today, but I think we can, in common with Goldscheid and Schumpeter, conceive of capital as being something like the class interests of asset owners under capitalism, understood as something having agency. Now, again, this is in contrast to a lot of writing today about the antagonism between capital and the state, where on a narrative level, capital is referred to as if it were a structural actor. But when you dig down to the details, there's nothing of substance there on an analytical level, just accounting artifacts like FDI, foreign direct investment. And you kind of think to yourself, is this your champion that can take on the collective might of the world's states and win an aggregation of digits in a ledger? No. Capital is a force affecting human lives more powerfully than any other, and it helps to analyze it as such. So thirdly, what I get from this is a utopian vision. These guys inhabit opposite ends of the political spectrum. Goldscheid was advocating state communism, and Schumpeter was advocating what I think we might now perhaps call anarcho-capitalism. But they could both see that having capital and the state duke it out over revenues in perpetuity isn't a sustainable way to organize society. They could see in 1917-18 the need to work out a vision for where society goes next, so that the problem of debt-laden, underfunded states wasn't going to stick around for another century, with people in unimaginably futuristic years like 2021 facing the same kinds of problems. So I think that's our responsibility as fiscal sociologists, not just to analyze how the tax state functions in the 21st century using the methods of sociology or what have you, but to think about what would be required in order for the tax state to be altogether abolished and replaced with something better. Ironically, what I don't get from this literature is a global vision. Goldscheid and Schumpeter were essentially just talking about the domestic public finances of Austria. I say ironically because the most famous bit in this originating fiscal sociology literature is the bit where Schumpeter says that it's all about listening to the thunder of world history. So there, I'll put that for just a second. It's a very famous quote, most famous quote in fiscal sociology, which isn't saying much, but it's saying a bit. Leave that up there for you all to read it. Right, the thunder of world history. So you're right, Joseph. And if we're going to do this, we need to think about the tax state as a global phenomenon, in a state of antagonism with capital as a global phenomenon. And that is what we're going to do. Okay, so there's the four things I get from fiscal sociology. I'm just going to leave that slide up for a couple of seconds before we move on to that question of thinking about capital as a sort of structural actor. Okay, so looking then at capital, I want to introduce you to the concept of the production boundary. Production boundary is the expression of a theory of value in the form of a boundary around those activities which create value, separating them from those activities which do not create value. So, for example, these days, mainstream marginalist economists would place their production boundary around the entire market for goods and services. This is because their theory of value is just a theory of how prices are arrived at in markets. And so if anything yields a price in a market, whatever process stands behind that price necessarily produces value. And here are the three inventors of marginalist value theory: Jevons, Menger, and Walras. And I'm going to put them there on the production boundary that they invented. Now, there are readings of Karl Marx that interpret his production boundary as being around the entire market for goods and services as well. So I'm going to put him here too. He's in shades because these are cool, fashionable readings of Marx. We're going to look at some unfashionable readings of Marx later. Okay. So that's the mainstream production boundary as defined by marginalist economists today and the cool reading of Marx. The production boundary of the classical political economists, such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo, was smaller. They treated value as something that's only produced in material production. And the reason why that's the case is important. So we're going to have a quick digression into classical value theory. Right. The purpose of value in classical political economy is to attempt to interrogate the existence of surplus in a systematic way. So in material production, more is produced than is consumed by the workers who produce it. So agricultural workers eat food, right? But there's a surplus of food for the rest of us to eat. Furniture makers need to sit down, but there's a surplus of chairs for the rest of us to sit on, and so on. In an aggregate, there must be a surplus because there are people who consume a lot of goods and don't produce any goods themselves. But at first glance, you can't think systematically about that surplus because output goods are generally different from the goods that people consume. So, for example, if a person spends all day mining nickel ore and then they go out and eat some poutine, how can we say they've produced more by way of nickel ore than they have consumed in terms of poutine? They're different things, right? What measure do they meaningfully have in common? And value in classical political economy isn't meant to be an explanation of price. It's meant to provide an answer to that question of what measure different things have in common. We say that, am I still there? Are you still getting me?
No.
Yeah, okay, cool. Sorry, just got a little warning up this end. Fine. So value in classical political economy isn't meant to be an explanation of price. It's meant to provide an answer to that question of what measure different things have in common. We say that more nickel ore is mined than poutine is consumed in terms of their respective values. And then the question is, what is this thing value that's possessed by all commodities, despite their all being different? And the thing is, that question doesn't really arise outside of material production, because outside of material production, there's no meaningful question of surplus. Take the example of a printed book and contrast the work of writing it with the work of printing it. If the workers at the print shop consumed all the books that they printed, there's a print shop. If the workers in the print shop consumed all the books they printed, there'd be no surplus books for the rest of us to read. But the author of a book can read as much text as they like, inevitably far more than they write, and there won't be any such problem. It doesn't matter how big the deficit between the amount of text they read and the amount of text they write, there'll still be no shortage of written text to go into books. The very concept of surplus is inapplicable in this context. So if I say all the value in a printed book is produced in the print shop and the author creates no value, it seems bananas on the face of it, but that's just because value these days is assumed to mean price. And whether a book in a railway station bookshop is priced at a price point you're prepared to pay depends on the extent to which you expect to like the text that's printed in it. But if what I mean is that the sum totality of human output is added to in the print shop, but not at the desk of the author, because the output we're concerned with is output insofar as it exceeds input, then it does make sense, because that calculus of outputs exceeding inputs doesn't apply in the case of authorship. Karl Marx had a brilliant analogy for explaining this. He contrasted the match that lights the fire with the fuel that's actually burnt in the fire. So the writing of the book is the match that lights the fire of your railway station bookshop purchase. But the fuel that's burnt in order to bring the subject matter of your purchase into being is the labor of the workers at the print shop. And the same logic can apply to, say, a smartphone. All the branding and the design and the coding and the rest of it is the match that lights the fire of your purchase of the phone. But the fuel that's burnt in order to bring the phone into existence is the labor that takes place down the mines and in the factories and along the logistics routes. Okay. So we've said that Smith and Ricardo operate this classical production boundary. I'm going to put Marx there too, look, but without shades, because this is the uncool reading of Marx we're talking about here. And I'm also going to put 20th century economist Piero Sraffa here, just because he's important and good. Now, I need to make it clear that neither Marx nor Sraffa simply came out with it and said, value is only produced in material production. But I'm designating them as operating the classical production boundary because, like classical political economists before them, their work is to do with this question of surplus, which, as I say, is only really crystallized into a question by activities within the sphere of material production. Now, just by way of a little aside, Marx's answer to the question of what value is for these purposes is particularly important because it's frightening. In answering the question of what property do these inputs and outputs share such that we can say there's a surplus, Marx showed that value is not simply an inert measure of some property possessed by all commodities. On the contrary, it's the driving force behind the chaos and contradiction of human society under the capitalist mode of production. So, for example, in a Marxist analysis, that antagonism over revenues that fiscal sociologists identify between capital and the state ultimately unfolds from the process of value blindly but relentlessly seeking to make more of itself. Anyway, there's the classical production boundary around material production, and we've already seen there's a wider production boundary around the entire market for goods and services. So we can place inside one and outside the other any number of, as it were, immaterial business functions. But I'm going to point to a few key ones, which we've already thought about in the context of the example of the smartphone. So R&D, product design, branding, marketing, advertising, coding in the case of tech and the digital economy, all very important business functions driving huge profits in the world today, which take place outside the classical production boundary. Remember, the fact that they cause market exchanges and therefore profit does not mean they create value in the classical sense because, like the authorship of books, these activities do not in any meaningful sense form part of a surplus where more is produced than is used up. Indeed, scarcity often has to be artificially imposed on the output of these business functions by means of intellectual property regimes. And today we've got a useful generic name for all of the output of these functions. We call them intangible assets. So let's roll them all up into business functions that yield intangible assets. Now, we can go still wider with our production boundary. So, for example, it's an oft encountered claim in feminist political economy that value is created by unwaged labor in the sphere of social reproduction. Domestic labor, as it's sometimes known. And there's some pics of Silvia Federici and Leopoldina Fortunati, who are Marxist feminists who have made that claim. But you also find arguments along these lines in feminist variants of mainstream economics, most famously perhaps in Marilyn Waring's book, If Women Counted. And relatedly, and importantly, you'll find it argued, for example, by Mariana Mazzucato, that wage labour in the public sector produces value. Now, when it comes to selecting a value theory, and therefore a production boundary for analytical purposes, you might think you'd want to select the most feminist one, because gendered oppression is such a major structural harm operating in the world today. But in fact, we're going to go the other way and select the classical production boundary. And you might say, well, hang on, Claire, isn't that a bit sexist? I mean, just look at the gender balance in your own slide. Can't you see the problem? And the answer is that I can see it, but I'm going to select the classical production boundary anyway. And the reason for that is as follows. Let's break that element of wage labour in the public sector down into two elements. And one of which is specifically the kind of public sector wage labour which serves to relieve the burden of unwaged labour in the sphere of social reproduction. So, for example, public provision of education, healthcare, care of the elderly, and so on. And the key point is that the extent to which the public sector relieves that burden of unwaged labour in the sphere of social reproduction is massively unequally distributed globally. In the global north, despite ubiquitous austerity policies, things are still much better on that front than they are in the global south. There's still overwhelmingly better public provision of the kinds of services that would otherwise be primarily provided unwaged in the home. So we need to look at the global inequalities that deprive states in the global south of fiscal resources as a prior step before making sure that our fiscal sociology is a feminist one. And in seeking to get to grips with those global inequalities, it's in seeking to get to grips with those global inequalities that the classical production boundary shows its analytical worth. Specifically, what the classical production boundary enables us to do is make sense of the so-called smile curve in global value chains. Now, the smile curve is a schematic graph of the amount of something called value added associated with various business functions disaggregated around the global production network. Value added is not to be confused with value or surplus value. It's an accounting artifact, meaning profit plus wages. Anyway, the business functions are meant to be shown in broadly chronological order. So first we develop a product, then we manufacture it, and then we sell it. So on the left, we have stuff like R&D and product design, and in the middle, we have the processes of material production, i.e. mining, agriculture, manufacture, bulk transportation. And then on the right, we have marketing, branding, advertising, and so on. It's not perfect. Why would you ship a product before you've branded it? But the idea is that if you arrange it this way, it comes out looking like a smile. And that smile is the happy smile of businesses and workers performing almost any other function than the functions within the classical production boundary. Because what the smile curve shows is that business functions within the classical production boundary, i.e. material production, are where wages are generally lowest and profitability most squeezed. There we go. Now you might say, oh, well, that just shows that the classical approach to value is nonsense. All the value is being created in those functions up the sides of the smile curve where intangible assets are created. But it doesn't show anything of the sort. The way to understand this in the classical framework is simply to treat those functions as affecting not the creation of value, but its capture. Think back to the example of the printed book. We saw that all value is created in the print shop because the authorial labour is just the match that sets your desire alight. And the labour in the print shop is the fuel that's burnt to actually bring the object of your desire into being. But the lion's share of the profitability will nonetheless accrue to the publisher who owns the copyright of the text. Creating value doesn't mean you get to accrue it in the form of cash money. So what the smile curve is really a picture of is how wages and profits are suppressed in the business functions where value as understood in the classical schema is created and captured by dint of the kinds of labour which give rise to intangible assets. That's the kind of labour performed up the sides of the smile curve there. Thinking back to the role of capital as an antagonist over revenues vis-a-vis the state, the position we're in now, therefore, is different from the one the original fiscal sociologists wrote about, because the revenues are not accruing primarily to the owners of the means of producing value, but to the owners of the means of capturing value, i.e. intangible assets. Means of production is to a great extent owned by a squeezed subcategory of capital, which has to confront head-on the chaos and contradiction on the front lines of the battle for surplus value, while the privileged monopolists get to reap the rewards in the crystalline safety of dematerialized asset regimes. Which is very interesting when you come to think about those regions outside the classical boundary that we looked at earlier. So previously, as described by Goldscheid and Schumpeter, it was a case of value being created within the classical production boundary, and some of it being extracted in the form of tax to fund activities outside that region, i.e. labour in the public sector. Whereas now, we have two regions outside the classical production boundary in contestation over the extent to which each of them is going to capture value from material production. And, of course, as well as being instrumental in value capture, intangible assets are, as everyone present in this colloquium will be only too aware, highly effective instruments of corporate tax avoidance. So we're in this situation where intangible assets, these instruments of value capture on the part of financialized corporate capital, are also the instruments by means of which financialized corporate capital gets to prevail against the state in its contestation over those very same revenues. And the question might be asked, why does the state put up with this? Those asset regimes emanate from the state. Why isn't the state taking control of the situation? And the answer to that lies in that issue of global inequality that I mentioned earlier. There's a very clear geographical asymmetry to this entire phenomenon. Going back to the smile curve, the functions at the bottom of the curve are disproportionately located in the global south. So if you analyze the global production network by means of the classical production boundary, what you see is that the value is predominantly being created in poor countries, but it's accruing to businesses and workers in the form of profits and wages, predominantly in rich countries. And it's those rich countries who control the international legal order under which that outcome arises. And it's at this juncture, a good half an hour or so into my presentation, that the questions of tax really start to get relevant. Okay, so let's look more closely at this smile curve. Recall that it shows us a picture of a kind of downward pressure on the market performance of those operating within the classical production boundary, so that value is captured elsewhere in the curve. Now, recall that it represents value added, which is wages plus profit. So first, let's disaggregate those two. Okay, so we've now got a wage region and a profit region under the curve. Now let's add in tax. That pink band in the middle is tax on wages and tax on profits. Look, I've got the pink band at the top of wages and at the bottom of profits so that they meet in the middle and they're one big band of tax. Right, now let's show the effect of intangible assets helping to relieve profits of tax as well as serving as instruments of value capture. The downward pressure extends across the curve now, but it's not on the main curve throughout. It's only on the main curve in the middle. Away from the middle, the downward pressure isn't on the main curve, it's on the tax take in respect of profits. But out here in the sides of the curve, there's also more, there's more by way of wages to tax. So reliance can be placed on them instead. So there's a kind of secondary downwards pressure passed on to the curve there where wages are taxed. Put simply then, the point is that rich countries who dominate the outsides of the curve can rely to a greater extent than poor countries on taxing employment income, and so don't need to worry so much about taxing profits. And that's well known. There's nothing innovative or at all surprising in that conclusion. It's got lots of empirical support, and it's essentially a basic tenet of the entire school of development studies that concerns itself with the fiscal plight of global south countries. But viewing it like this shows us a couple of extra things. First, it shows us that the phenomenon isn't just a kind of arbitrary quirk of the spatial distribution of different business functions within the global production network. It ultimately arises from the core structural antagonism under capitalism, i.e. the one that subsists between labour and the owners of means of production at the sites where value is created, i.e. within the classical production boundary. The world's asset-owning classes have placed that source of chaos and crisis predominantly at arm's length from themselves at the other end of global value chains, while still positioning themselves as able to capture the lion's share of value from those chains, and this illustrates how that plays out in the fiscal sphere. The second thing it shows us is that what's going on is a kind of neo-imperial tax farming. The owners of intangible assets capture value from production in poor countries without those poor countries having any opportunity to derive revenue from it, because it doesn't arise as profit in the hands of the owners of the means of production. But rich countries can tax it instead, to the extent that it winds up paying the salaries of employees in the business functions which generate and maintain those intangible assets. And sustaining a global legal order in which intangible assets have this dual function means that elites globally get to accrue untaxed profits from production in poor countries, but rich countries get to share in the spoils to a certain extent. Okay, so all of this looks pretty bad. And I want to remind you that our task as fiscal sociologists is a utopian one. Is there a way in which we can perform some kind of judo maneuver on this problem so that it ends up abolishing the tax state and paving the way to post-capitalist plenty for all? And I think there is. And the key to it is a fact about the smile curve that I've been withholding from you until this point, but which should seem immediately obvious the moment I mention it, which is that the smile curve is deepening. A third role being played by these intangible assets is keeping a lid on capitalist productivity, but redirecting greater and greater proportions of capitalist output to labour in sectors which don't produce anything. Now, there's a lot to say about that from a Marxist perspective, and there's a long tradition of people working within a Marxist framework to explain how capitalism preserves itself from crisis by redirecting output away from production in this way. Perhaps the best known example being the monopoly capitalism school of thinking, which I recommend you look into. There isn't really time today to do that, but it's easy to see why you might come to this conclusion. Recall Schumpeter's prediction that unfettered capitalism will, of its own motion, usher in a world of post-capitalist plenty. How would this world come about? Capitalism requires some people to need to work for a living, while the profits accrue to asset owners. Why would asset owners want to usher in a world where no one has to work for a living? Where would their profits come from? And how would the people who are no longer working for a living pay for their plenteous consumption of goods? The whole thing doesn't make any sense at all. Much easier for capitalism if the world of universal plenty is perpetually staved off by directing output away from production. In that context, I just want to remind you about the opposition between these two categories of non-value producing activity: the labour that produces and maintains intangible assets, and public sector labour that relieves the gendered burden of unwaged labour in the sphere of social reproduction. If capitalism has a growing and uncapped capacity to fund labour that yields intangible assets, indeed a need to fund it or something like it in order to stave off a crisis of overproduction, why not instead progressively fund public sector labour that relieves the gendered burden of unwaged labour in the sphere of social reproduction? I'm talking about healthcare, education, care of the elderly, that kind of thing. And why not do so in the global south, where the work in question is most urgently in need of resources? So we talk a lot in the world of tax justice about reallocating profits for tax purposes to poor countries. And you could interpret what I'm saying as a call for that as a policy objective. And there's an extent to which that's exactly what I'm saying. But we can't address the problem I'm identifying using the currently proposed tools, not even the core tax justice ask of full unitary taxation of multinational enterprises and formulary apportionment of the proceeds. This is because the allocation mechanisms in prospect are either to jurisdictions where the MNE in question has operations, or to so-called market jurisdictions. Neither of these allocation mechanisms would allocate profitability for tax purposes to the global south jurisdictions where those materially productive functions are predominantly situated. That's the whole point of disaggregation of functions along global value chains. You get to foist on some low margin arm's length contractor the dirty work of actually producing stuff. So what we need is unitary taxation by formulary apportionment, not merely of MNEs, but entire global value chains. And we need the apportionment factor to be something like headcount in respect of materially productive assets. Okay, so that would really reallocate taxing rights over corporate profits to the jurisdictions where value is created, the jurisdictions where hyper-exploited and fiscally under-resourced populations of workers produce the stuff that people in the global north disproportionately consume. So far, so radical. But how is this utopian? Well, what if we progressively increase the minimum corporate tax rate to 100%? This would progressively cause public sector labour to replace the labour which yields intangible assets as the primary outlet for surplus capitalist productivity. And this would restore to primacy within the sphere of capitalist activity, capital's core technology enhancing function of placing the means of material production in the hands of competing capitals. And as it becomes increasingly available for humans around the world to sell their labour to states, while consumer demand remains undiminished, capital will have no choice but to concentrate on increasing automation of material production. And eventually, as the corporate tax rate approaches mere basis points below 100%, and the number of workers in the corporate sector drops to zero, and all our material needs are being met by robots, while our only labour is caring for each other, a synthesis of the contradictory utopian visions of Goldscheid and Schumpeter will have been realised. And that's the end of my presentation.